Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you are listening to StrategyCon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. It is Thursday, March 16, 2017, episode 26. I am SIA intern Ms. Shahrezad. Today it is my pleasure to introduce CEO of SIA and host of the StrategyCon podcast, Dr. John Bruni, and co-host and SIS resident existentialist philosopher, David Onley. Before we get started on today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that StrategyCon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, as well as linked to our podcast on Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. In today's episode, we will be continuing our examination of the book Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War. As our listeners will recall, Ghost Fleet, published in 2015, looks at the likely future of warfare as it is transpires between a hypothetical Sino-Russian alliance against the United States in the 2030s. In our first analysis, we looked at the issues of high-technology combat and how the interrelatedness of overlapping global supply chains could hamper U.S. military dominance. We also explored the effects of two other spheres of modern combat, space and cyberspace. Today we'll take a different turn. Question to John: does the Sino-Russian alliance seem credible? If not, why not?
Well, Shahrezad, from a superficial perspective, it seems credible. After all, both China and Russia are autocracies. However, in spite of their commonalities from a political perspective, Russia fears China because of its economic success and its demographic size. This fills Moscow with a sense of dread that China poses a clear and present danger of undermining Russia's hold over its Siberian territories. It already hosts many Chinese people and businesses in these territories, and just like the so-called Palestinian demographic bomb that will eventually threaten the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, Russia fears that in the not-too-distant future, there won't be enough Russians in Siberia to maintain Moscow's hold over this potentially rich area, leaving it open to Chinese settlement and control. China also fears Russia. Putin has been a cunning player on the international scene and has acted quickly in the national interest when called for. We only have to see how Moscow was so swift to act against Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine in 2014 as examples of this. It doesn't fear using its large and largely antiquated military forces to intervene in remote areas such as Syria in 2015. So long as it is done rapidly and for strategic effect. The level of unpredictability shown by Moscow must worry the Chinese Politburo. Furthermore, the high level of Chinese dependence on Russian military technology must be resented in certain quarters in China, since China cannot really move under its own weight within its own sphere of interest without the full backing of the Kremlin. Mitigating circumstances, however, such as the fact that both Russia and China are rising powers, determined to challenge the prowess of the United States, a country that has been deliberately seeking to untangle itself from overseas commitments since the end of the Bush administration, are seeking to overturn the American order close to their respective borders. As America shrinks its commitments to preserve the post-World War II order it set up 70 years ago, new opportunities for Russia and China are emerging, and cooperation between them may turn them into formal allies at some point, so we can't dismiss this prospect entirely.
So how do you think, David? Is the Sino-Russian ally seem credible?
Like John said, there is some potential, it would seem, in future for them to put some sort of alliance together. But the idea in the book that Russia is desperate for credibility, desperate for a place in the world, when Putin is so willing and able to use limited power effectively, the Chinese must be in awe of his ability to leverage small numbers of people, not really masses of money, into incredibly effective political destabilization. Whether it's acting in Syria to complicate anything the world might want to do about Syria, whether it's now putting special forces into Egypt on the Libyan border, making everyone go, well, what will Russia do there? Whether it's selling weapons systems to anyone in the world who wants to upgrade and have an ability to stand up to other people with advanced weapons systems. If we look at the last year's US presidential election, essentially the Russians are being accused of hacking everybody, the Democrats and potentially the Trump camp. If the Russians are so sophisticated at destabilizing democracy through cyber intrusion, why would they ever need to resort to weapons and being the junior partner in an alliance? And from the Chinese side, how could the Chinese ever trust Russia? Yes, the Chinese will eventually have millions of people in Siberia and massive amounts of investment there. But Russia historically has shown that it can be exposed to the West. Its leaders can try and make it more Western. But it seems to consistently remain Russian and want to be something it defines from its past. This does not seem to open a door to anything more than pragmatic exchange of manufactured goods from China in exchange for energy and weapon systems from Russia, and some sort of uncomfortable compromise for access to Siberia. The idea of a short, hot, nasty war between Russia and China that doesn't lead to a very specific outcome seems in some ways even more likely in the 2030s than a war between China and America.
I think you've really nailed it there, David. I mean, I can see that there are more things actually separating Russia from China than bringing them together, except for their common hatred of the United States. But this gives the US an enormous bargaining chip in a triangular relationship where it can basically dictate terms, either to sway one side to its camp or the other. It's not like that there is a fourth option for either Russia or China to go to. I mean, there's only the United States. Both of them want to be friends with the United States for their own particular reasons, because they know that by themselves they can't really achieve much.
It comes down to almost my enemy's enemy is my friend.
Yeah.
So if they both can't get along with America, it's in their interest to push pragmatism as far as humanly possible. I think the other thing too is the way the relationship is described in the book strikes me as characteristic of the limitation of American understanding of the rest of the world. If people aren't American and don't want to be American, then of course they can get along because they're not us. So it's almost like the Americans really can't necessarily conceive that each culture, each state has an identity that they do care about and want to maintain, and would not sacrifice necessarily without good reason.
Well, let's talk about China. Where do we think China is heading? David?
See, this is, again, flows directly out of what we were just talking about, that the idea of the directorate in the book, the idea at some point that in the 2020s, the Chinese population begin to rise to try and bring about democracy, and the Communist Party assumes that the military will intervene, that there'll be another Tiananmen, they'll crush the majority of Chinese people again, and that the premise in the book is that the military and the oligarchs make a deal. Now, it's a fascinating idea because the Communist Party lacks so much credibility. It's corrupt as corrupt, probably getting worse despite the show trials. The billionaires have got rich out of that corruption, and yet at the same time, the Communist Party is asking the People's Liberation Army to be more and more professional and to get its nose out of the trough. So how is it that you can hypothesize a directorate that is oligarchs who are the direct consequence of the corruption, and a military who are meant to be above and beyond that kind of behaviour, coming up with a compromise to replace an authoritarian communist party that's not credible. It's a great idea for driving the story forward, and it historically seems appealing to us, but it misses the point. Someone like Putin sorted out the oligarchs and the military. There is no evidence in China that anyone has the capacity to do those two things or bring them together, I don't think, at the moment.
I think that China is actually very atypical of a rising power. There is very little about the nature of China's economy, at least in the next 2 decades, that will allow it to generate a sort of self-sufficiency for it to move forward in a strategic sense. I mean, essentially, ever since the 1978 opening to the world, a lot of what we see in China is foreign-owned and foreign-funded. It is not necessarily funded and owned by the Chinese government. Now, I know, of course, the Chinese have been making inroads into trying to create a sense of self-sufficiency by maintaining its, very corrupt state-owned enterprises, very inefficient state-owned enterprises as well. But it's nowhere near as technically competent as it should be for China to be a rising power. If you take the historic example of any other state that tried to overturn the international order, say for instance Germany prior to World War I, I mean, they were doing import substitution left, right and centre. The Brits are doing that, are they? Oh, let's see if we can do our own widget. And all of a sudden they ended up having a massive industry, and they were in direct competition with the British. The Chinese can't create that sort of competitive edge with the United States. The United States is a net manufacturer, and even if it's manufacturing its key componentry offshore in a place like China, that's still American owned. Now, of course, the Chinese can tap into it, it can bug it, it can sabotage it and do all that kind of stuff, but it can't own that sort of productive capacity. And this is where I think China's strategic presence is really still very much like a minnow. It's not the big giant that we think it is. Take the foreign enterprises out of China, and China is a very anemic country. I would even go so far as to say, if you take the foreign enterprises out of China, China becomes a third world state overnight.
And if we add to that, if you go, the advantage that brought foreign enterprises to China was low-cost labour. For how much longer is low-cost labour relevant?
Well, and here's the interesting point. Political economists have always said that the West owns China because of the very thing that we were talking about, that there's so much Western capital and foreign direct investment has gone into China, that if China were to do something to step out of line, it would be up to Western governments to mobilize those companies that are in China operating there to move out. So there'll be a capital flight that was generated, right? So if there was this capital flight generated, political economists said that, well, it would just be a matter of time before these enterprises that are currently entrenched in China will find another home. We'll just pack up the plant and we'll shift it across to Nigeria, or we'll shift it to Indonesia, or we'll shift it somewhere else. But the interesting thing about the interrelatedness of China with the rest of the global economy that moved there is no company wants to see that, because the hit to their bottom line is going to be significant. You can't just pack up a factory. I mean, from a political perspective, if you're a member of the Politburo, I'd say, holy crap. It looks like the idea of, confronting the Americans in the South China Sea is not doing too well for us, because all of a sudden Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and all the other big names are starting to flee out of the country. Now, you could sit back and say, well, I'll take that hit because the strategic benefits outweigh the potential risk to the economy. But what happens if all of a sudden those companies that leave transplant themselves elsewhere? But if they do transplant themselves elsewhere, the amount of cost that those companies will have to bear on their shoulders for moving out of China is too significant, I would argue. It's not a matter of, I've got a factory here, just move it over there. That gives one a false sense of security in terms of having ownership and control in today's interrelated world, don't you think?
Interestingly, with that, we do have a bit of a precedent for that Japan from the late 90s onwards moved car production to places like Thailand. Now, what is very interesting there is that in a lot of cases, once they could get higher levels of efficiency in Japan and bring the cost back down, they wanted the level of quality they could produce with predominantly robots and some humans in Japan, and they moved production back to Japan.
Yeah, but that wasn't in a warlike
No.
setting.
But
I mean, what we're talking
Mercedes is not going to give up building cars somewhere in Europe. It's probably going to also end up building cars somewhere in America if there is tariff restrictions. So this idea that everyone's got the eggs in the China basket, would it be enormously painful to have to leave a market? Absolutely. But if there is no labour cost advantage, why do you stay? So
Surely
do you
it's
start
gotta-
planning to leave?
Yeah, all right. Surely it's got to be more than just labour cost advantage. I mean, for decades now, Western companies have been operating in China, and even though we in the West, the market that absorbs the cheaper goods coming out of China, complain about the shoddy workmanship and so on and so forth, those companies are so used to dealing with the Chinese model of organisation, mobilisation and production and logistics that if we were to sort of transplant those factories because of a strategic crisis, and they were then to land in Indonesia, for instance, it's not a matter of just taking the plant and shifting it. You're going to have to make sure that the workforce is responsive and can match the quote-unquote quality of Chinese workmanship. Otherwise, the market starts losing traction anyway, because all of a sudden, the Mercedes-Benz that comes out of an Indonesian factory, which is far, far worse than when it was established in China, it will take at least a good decade for the Indonesian workers to get up to spec to operate the new machinery, the new plant, and so on and so forth. I don't believe for a moment that the political economists are right in saying that there is this free movement. There is no such thing as there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as free movement of labour without cost. Right? I mean, that's just an opinion that I've got because I like to I like giving a swipe to the political economists out there, but because sometimes I think that they oversimplify things to make a point that it's all about the money and all you have to do is follow the money. Well, if it was that simple, then we would be in a tariff-free world already. But everyone looks after their own borders, whether they be financial borders or any other border, because there is something called the national interest that hasn't just dissipated.
But if the national interest is back on the rise, if nationalism is becoming more normal, and we're still 13 years away from the 2030s, how much does national interest demand a gradual pressure on companies to pull away from low-cost production in places that there is no national interest in? So, this week we've seen the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund say we won't deal with these 62 major global companies because their ethics are atrocious. Their environmental record is atrocious. Now, this is idealism getting in the way, but if idealism can get in the way, I can't conceive why nationalism can't also get in the way.
Well, I think that we're starting to see that in the United States. I mean, funnily enough, Ghost Fleet was written in 2015, so it's pre-Trump, and I don't think that anyone in 2015 would have been able to confabulate a United States in the way that it's currently transforming itself. I mean, a country that is basically reaching out to Russia, which has been considered a foe of the United States and certainly an anti-democratic force around the world for decades. We've seen this rise of American nationalism, wanting to pull back productive capacities that it offshore to places like China back into the United States. What we're seeing at the moment is a fundamental reordering of the international order under Trump. And we're also seeing something that really took place under the Obama years, and that is the retrenchment of US power and commitments overseas. The Americans are not willing, after Afghanistan and Iraq, to put their money where their mouth is and start really sort of ramping up in a significant way in areas that are remote locations. Syria would be a case in point. You mentioned Libya and the Russians getting involved in Libya. Well, the Russians wouldn't get involved in Libya if the Americans were there. And if the Americans were in Syria in a way that would be meaningful in terms of pushing back Russian power, the Russians wouldn't challenge either. So if the Americans are vacating the stage, that leaves it open for Russia to push, because Russia can and has pushed up to now, but now it has no counterbalance, no counterweight in the absence of the United States. And China can probably do something, but it won't go as feral, if I can put it to you that way, as the Russians. I mean, they'll be very cautious because they know that their economic interlinkages, they don't want to gamble with having factory closures, because even a handful of factories of big brand names closing in China will mean people on the street looking for work. And when people have idle times on their hands, they start getting anti-government sentiments. In places like China, that means trouble. And the Politburo doesn't want that. So they want to sort of obfuscate, or reduce the aspect of trouble being thrown their way.
So let's talk about China's partner, Russia. Where do we think Russia is heading? John?
Well, Russia is interesting because Russia is far less dependent on the international economy than China. That's not to suggest that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia hasn't benefited from a more liberal economic order and a more liberal political order, but it is an illiberal entity. And during the Soviet times, the Russians did do import substitution, and a lot of the stuff, Russian TVs, Russian cars, Russian whatever, jet aircraft, a lot of that was substandard by Western standards, but still it allowed Russia to get out of the entanglements of Western capital. And they have somehow managed, by hook and by crook, to retain that capacity to stand apart from, but not necessarily not part of, but just, stand a little bit further away from the international economy, which gives it more room to maneuver. It can do more than China. And as we've seen, the Russians, since the 2014 their 2014 intervention into Ukraine and the capture of Crimea, they've been under international sanctions, and Russians are a hardy people. They lived through Joseph Stalin. They lived through horrible times under the Tsars, horrible times under most Soviet leaders, up until Gorbachev at least, and even then it wasn't fun. So when you kind of think of the Russian culture, they've had to deal with a lot over a long period of time. So anything that lightens their load is paradise to them. So they can weather the storm of a few international sanctions. And the Kremlin, the political sort of class is very adept at maneuvering themselves out of harm's way. I mean, that's what got them into power. I mean, they got into power, they were very adept at doing that, otherwise the people would have chucked them out, because Russia has a revolutionary history. If the people are angry enough and motivated enough, they will go after their politicians and hang or string them up by the nearest lamppost. So and Putin's very clever as well. He's played that populist leader to a degree. I mean, I know that there are ructions within Russia at the moment, and there is an opposition movement of sorts, but it's kind of incoherent, and every time there is a top dog, Putin has him eliminated. So Putin is the only person still standing. Nonetheless, capitalizing on Russian nationalism, Putin's done a great job as an autocrat. And I hate to say it, but he's a smart guy. He's a smart operator. And when we were talking about the whole notion of Ghost Fleet and this idea of Russia and China coming together in some sort of formalized, meaningful way in an alliance structure, what freaks the Chinese out is Putin. I mean, if Putin was merely a Soviet-era technocrat, was very functional in his outlook, that would make the Chinese breathe a sigh of relief. But Putin's highly ambitious. And as I said, you saw that the Russian aircraft carrier, the only one in its fleet, the Kutuzov, it was chugging around. It had smoke belching out. Once it got to just off the Syrian coast, it lost 2 of its aircraft. Not particularly competent in terms of mobilizing naval firepower, but Putin doesn't care. Putin has an ambition, he wants to do it, and he will use whatever is in the Russian inventory to make a point. And I think that for many countries, including China, this is a level of unpredictability that they don't like. Chinese are very predictable in their nature and structures. They they have this 1,000-year-old Mandarin culture where it's all down this particular road, very Confucian, very, and the Russians aren't like that at all. They have a totally different culture. And I think that Putin is actually playing on that also to signal to the Chinese, watch it, because maybe one day we're going to be at war, maybe one day there's going to be some sort of conflict, and if that's the case, maybe we will actually use nuclear weapons, because you got more people than we have. And, you know, we like our Siberia. We may not have so many Russians in it, but we certainly want to exploit it.
Do you agree, David?
With a lot of it, yeah. To go back to import substitution, the fact that they've managed to do that all over again since 2014, that the Russians have managed to make a Russian variant of most things. Now, it's cost them a fortune, but once again, they just did it. And who else can we imagine just getting on with it and having a population who are actually so used to things being difficult that they still just keep on coping?
But if you want to be a revisionist power, David, you can't be linked to the global economy like China is.
No.
You want to be a revisionist power, you've got to say, hey, listen, I know that my Russian-built flat-screen TV is far, far inferior to the South Korean Samsung variant, but you still get a flat-screen TV.
Yeah, it's plenty good enough for watching propaganda put out by Putin.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing, and I still think this is critical, and we talked about it before, is that Putin has tamed the oligarchs and the military. There is no evidence that the oligarchs can act independently. There is no evidence the military would want to act independently. And there's certainly no evidence that, for the average Russian, Putin is seen as illegitimate. In the history of Russian, leaders, autocrats, he's quite reasonable. He makes sure there's food and stuff. He only gets rid of senior opposition figures. The place functions better than it did in the 80s.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll pick up where we left off on David's thoughts on Vladimir Putin on our special episode, Ghost Fleet Part 2. And that was Europe with their 1986 classic, The Final Countdown. This is Strategicon, the podcast of SIA, and you're listening to episode 26, Ghost Fleet Part 2. We'll now pick up where we left off with David's thoughts on Vladimir Putin.
Really, in the scheme of things, his de-linked form of authoritarianism, where he's always got things people value. He's always got energy, he's always got minerals, he's got advanced enough weapon systems that there's plenty of customers, and he's got that ability to leap into vacuums and do something faster than anyone else.
And he's also got that relationship with India, which from an arms selling perspective is a wonderful thing for the Russians, but if you're China's, military, you'd be wondering, well, okay, if the Russians did not agree with China pushing the Americans over whatever the topic of the day happens to be, all they need to do is turn off the tap and flick all their efforts onto India. India will be a main beneficiary of getting cheap Russian weapons. China will be without cheap Russian weapons. And, the level of their military industries or defense industries are still subpar when it comes to matching whatever they're getting from the Russians. I mean, by quite a stretch. the Russians are furnishing the People's Liberation Army, Air Force, Navy with everything.
And this is a significant point in Ghost Fleet that India is never mentioned.
Yeah.
Partially for this reason, partially also for the Indian relationships now with the Europeans to gain access to weapons. This is a state that by the 2030s, if they just keep gradually accumulating good stuff, will be quite militarily capable and is a definite potential adversary to China at some point, once again in the near future. Why would we imagine a China-America war when, in a sense, a China-Russia exchange seems possible? An India-China exchange at some point even seems probable.
Well, especially if Pakistan is involved and China is supporting Pakistan, which then leads us to one extra thing on this sort of Sino-Russian element, and that is North Korea. We currently got military exercises in South Korea, and of course the North Koreans have been launching missiles in a vain attempt to stick it to the Americans in however way they think they're sticking it to the Americans. In response to that, of course, the Americans have now deployed the Theater High Altitude Air Defense System, the THAAD, into South Korea. THAAD is, for those who don't know, the land-based variant of the very able Aegis missile system. You can shoot a missile down with another missile, and that is, from a anti-ballistic missile defense perspective, a very good thing. Except for the fact that right next door to North Korea is China. Now, China doesn't have a great quantity of ballistic missiles. We don't know exactly what quality of missiles the Chinese have because they've never really been shot off in anger, so, we're only speculating that they're half good. But they may not be half good, and they may be vulnerable to being shot down by THAAD. So, of course, now the Chinese are starting to come down heavily on the Americans, saying that this is not a good thing that you've done by deploying THAAD to South Korea because it threatens our deterrent. Which leads me to the next thing. In case North Korea were to do something daft, and, again, many people have been speculating over this for decades. And so far, the North Koreans have kept their powder dry, which is good. But as the international climate changes and things become much more loose and fluid, what if the North Koreans were to do something? Would the Chinese rush to their assistance as per the 1968 treaty that they signed off with Pyongyang? Because ultimately, the Chinese would not want American or South Korean soldiers sitting on the Yalu River border between North Korea and China. So would they be drawn into that kind of conflict? And how would that change the balance of power in Northeast Asia?
Or would China end up being the people who pacified North Korea? That North Korea goes too crazy, it's China that can really cut off the economic links for things they desperately need.
What,
so
coal?
Well, coal and probably every other thing that's smuggled over the river. Again, if North Koreans keep smuggling themselves out of North Korea, how much stuff must be smuggled in?
Well, the North Korean black economy is about as black as it can be. I mean, it's even more mafia than the mafia. And because the Chinese are profiting from the illicit trafficking of North Koreans, either into sex slavery or whatever, and then there's, all these other illicit activities going on that aren't necessarily the purview of the state to look after, could they close down those avenues?
Why would they want to? Isn't it actually the best way to help North Korea just implode? To keep feeding DVDs across the river? To keep making sure that cell phone signal gets across? So that your family member that escaped 10 years ago, made it to South Korea, can come back through China and go, hi there, it's all good, get out. If you actually want to make sure that the Hermit Kingdom implodes, continuing to help an illicit trade across the border might be the best way to just make sure that it's impossible for North Korea to function.
Yeah.
So really, the idea, the Chinese don't like THAAD being anywhere nearby, but why would the Chinese support North Korea when there's nothing for them to gain? The best thing that they can have is North Korea become profoundly dysfunctional and literally become a proper client state, where they just incorporate it into a broader system of, look, we'll make sure there's enough economic opportunities for you, but you give up your weapons, you give up your loony dreams. We'll rehabilitate you over 50 years into the lowest cost factory district for making the cheapest, nastiest things that we don't make anymore in China proper.
Well, that sounds far, far more likely than Ghost Fleet.
Precisely.
Talking about Ghost Fleet, in the book, Poland makes a deal for nukes. Does this seem credible? David, what do you think?
It's a fascinating idea because I'm quite sure the Poles would love the ability to look at the Russians and go away. It's a lovely concept for the Poles to turn around hundreds of years of history of geographically being in exactly the wrong spot. And if America was desperate enough, maybe you'd make a deal going, well, it's only 10 nuclear weapons. If they launch 10, they can't take the world out. And surely Russia's not going to launch everything they've got, or would they? And I think that's the wonderful thing. If we're talking in the 2030s, we're probably still talking Putin, or Putin's hand-picked successor by then, perhaps. And if Poland had 10 nukes, would Putin retaliate with 10? Or would he once again fill a vacuum, take action, go while everyone's destabilised? Even in a desperate situation, I cannot conceive how a risk like that could be taken if Russia is as dangerous and capable as it still appears to be. The Poles just don't have the experience in being a player at that level to risk nuclear war devastating Europe.
It's an interesting idea. Poland has had such a checkered history in Europe. For much of its time, there was the Polish people, but there was no Poland. And when there was a Poland, it was usually under the thumb of a European empire, either Austria-Hungary or Russia or both, and Germany. So, it was essentially a divided state, kind of like what the Kurds are today. Would they actually go for nukes, and would nukes actually be a deterrent to Russian action? Well, the Russians have this extraordinary capacity to land their little green men in places where they're not expected. And one aspect that I think would be very, very interesting would be that little formerly German or Prussian enclave called Kaliningrad, which the Russians had taken over after the partition of Germany and after World War II. And at the moment, the Russians have got quite a few of their medium-range ballistic missiles in that area. It's like the point of a dagger in the heart of Europe, in a sense. And it's right next door to Poland, and in that area they could launch Spetsnaz forces going in there into Gdansk and doing all kinds of damage, and they don't even need to be wearing a uniform. They could just be people dressed up to look like average Polish citizens or Polish workers going about their business, and all of a sudden things blow up and don't work. So would they even want to? I mean, even if the Poles were to get 10 nukes and a proper command and control system, would that deter the Russians from doing the nasty on Warsaw? I doubt it. I think that the Russians are cunning enough to know where to push, how to push, and at what level they can get away with nastiness. Because really, even if Russian special forces were to wipe out Gdansk, just the shipyards, for nothing else, which would be a net economic detriment to Poland, what would the Polish government do? Launch a nuke at Russia? They can't use it.
To take your point further, I think this is a critical thing the book doesn't deal with either. Okay, an old Russian submarine in the Polish Navy gets used to bring the SEALs ashore onto Hawaii. Lovely idea. Every other piece of kit that Poland is going to have by the 2030s, if they continue their purchasing pattern, is going to be the same American kit that fails in the first day in the book. So you're going to have the Poles with 10 nuclear weapons, no conventional forces that can function reliably, mothballed Soviet-era kit that is essentially useless, and as you said, the little green men doing whatever they're going to do. So you've got 10 nukes that are dangerous to use, no means of defending them, and no credible conventional alternative.
Yeah, it's a scary, scary scenario.
It's a don't go there scenario.
According to the book, NATO implodes. Are we surprised by this? John?
No. Look, again, one has to take into account that
the book was written in 2015, and a lot of history has taken place since the writing of the book, which makes some of the findings in Ghost Fleet very fictional now. Probably at the time of writing, it seemed reasonable to assume that anything that the authors were thinking of back in 2013 to 14 would just be a continuum, because things seem to have developed in a relatively incremental phase. But now things have been moving along tectonic shifts, and we no longer live in that world of comfortable small changes.
We have Trump now.
Well, that's right. We have Trump, and we also have Brexit. And the problem with Brexit, of course, is that it raises the uncertainty of the UK's position in Europe, not only from a European Union perspective, but also from a NATO perspective. And a Europe that is quote-unquote united without the United Kingdom becomes far less sure of its ability to defend itself against anyone. From a cultural standpoint and from a grander strategic standpoint as well. I kind of think that the idea of NATO imploding is still on the cards, especially if we see a collapse in the European Union project within the next 18 months. And I don't want to predict this because, again, predictions normally don't actually, take place in a good and orderly way. But I do think that there is a very deep feeling in Europe that some big things are going to be happening there over the next 18 months, and some of those big things could be a seismic shift in terms of how the larger European economies function, and if they go down, like if the Italians go down, if the Germans go down, if the French go down, even if the UK were to reconsider their ability to want to join the European Union, 2 years from now or 18 months from now, there may not be a European Union for the UK to rejoin. So perhaps it was a smart move by the Brits to leave the Europeans because they've left effectively a bureaucratic mess. What do you think, Dave?
I think NATO depends on the economic well-being of a successful Europe. And if you now potentially have the UK out of it because of Brexit, and yet we still have the German and French banks really still on a knife edge, they're still leveraged at levels far more dangerous than the Wall Street banks were pre-GFC. And, at the moment we're pretending it's not as bad as it is, because what's the alternative? So I don't think it will be that NATO will disappear for tactical or strategic reasons. It's likely to disappear simply because economically it cannot be sustained. People just won't be willing to spend the money when the French and German banking systems finally genuinely implode.
There's the other aspect, of course, and that is Turkey. And, Turkey is a member of NATO, and from a functional perspective, what President Erdogan is doing is antithetical to a lot of the principles that NATO has been founded on. It is now becoming an autocracy. And as it is becoming an autocracy, it is looking like an alien among the pack of NATO members. Could you foresee a time when the issue of Turkey, which is always going to revolve around the Kurds, whether the Kurds are inside Turkish borders or just over the border in Syria or just over the border in Iraq, breaks NATO's fixation with keeping Turkey as a member? And could that not in itself act as a, second order collapse for NATO entirely?
Well, having to deal with Turkey is a perfect way to say we have to reconsider what the alliance is. If Turkey's going to keep calling the Dutch Nazis, we're well on the path to how and why is this part of one organisation that claims to do mutual defence? How can we have mutual defence when Turkey has gone so far away from what it was even 10 years ago? So between the economic pressures and the potential problem of Turkey, and Britain now being on the outside of the European Union potentially, it seems that there are 3 points where things could fall to bits long before any conflict where one of the allies tries to draw NATO in as a consequence of the alliance. That it could be so degraded that there's just no one ready to respond economically or militarily at the time that a member says, help me, help me.
Or even the United States to respond, for that matter.
Well, again, Trump's going to spend lots of money on defence, or so he's claiming.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean he'll want to go and work with anyone or build alliances. It could be the isolationist model of, I just want to have enough stuff to be scary.
The Munich Security Conference, I think, said quite a lot about what Europeans think of the current Trump administration and its commitment to defending Europe. What are your thoughts on that?
I think everyone's trying to put a nice gloss on it, but anyone in the background has to be going, we aren't willing to spend the money to defend ourselves, and the Americans want to do their own thing and want us to pull our weight. There is potentially an insurmountable gap.
So, talking about NATO, let's talk about England. According to the book, England sits out the war. Why? Why do you think that, John?
Well, I think, strangely enough, we just touched on it, I think it's going to be because Brexit is with us. It's a reality now. The UK is crafting its own future apart from the continent, as opposed to being part of the continent. And I think that is, we still have a long way to determine exactly to what end Prime Minister Theresa May is going to take the UK. I suspect that the British people are quite pragmatic about things, and I think that if May can strike some form of deal with the European Union before the European Union implodes, perhaps the UK will be allowed some form of compromise status within the European Union structure, and also it will allow NATO members, who are also European Union members, to breathe a sigh of relief in terms of, the whole European project. Although it's highly speculative at this point in time. David?
I wonder if it's as simple as, again, the book wouldn't have known the Brexit was on the cards, but you have more billionaires in London than basically anywhere. Most of them aren't English. It represents the biggest pool of money and network probably anywhere on the planet. And why would the Brits want to put all that at risk? There's too much to gain, in a sense, if they're going to leave Europe, from leveraging the fact that people live there because it's a nice place. You can put your money there, you can put your family there, you can have a nice life, you can do business openly and safely, and that they could be very valuable things by the 2030s. And it might be in Britain's interest to be very much a separate entity that can offer all those advanced banking and financial services, and provide weapon systems, and provide advanced manufacturing in specialist areas. All of that could be really valuable if you have less clear ties with your former allies. You might give them the best position to interact with the Middle East, to interact with China. The Brits, they talk about the special relationship with the United States. Well, it wasn't so special at the end of World War II, where they were the declining empire and were put in their box. Here's their chance, potentially, to get some of their mojo back by standing independently. Pragmatism and greed, put them together. It seems a winning formula for doing their own thing.
It's like trying to reboot Austin Powers.
Final question to both of you. Australia is blockaded. What does this suggest about future Australian defence planning? David first?
What it suggests to me is, why the heck do we waste time planning for near-peer enemies? We don't really have any near-peers. There's no one else little with reasonably cool stuff that we're going to go up against. We're either going to be in an alliance with a major player, or we're going to be against a major player. And what the book suggests is, quite simply, our major ports are blockaded with drone fleets. That actually, to me, sounds like a completely credible way to shut down Australia's economy. If you can't export coal, iron ore, gas, wheat, wool on ships, you've essentially undone the Australian economy. And it doesn't matter if Australians can move around by plane. If we can't sell stuff to make money, we are essentially out of the game very quickly. And I think my lesson from that is, it really doesn't matter who we side with. We still essentially are going to play a bit part and need to be really careful that we don't antagonise people and give them a reason to shut down our entire economy.
Don't you think that the interrelatedness between Australia, the United States, China, gives us a sense of protection because everyone needs to have the commodities that Australia has? Why would you blockade something? I mean, unless you want to actually physically take hold of parts of the continent and, you know, for your own exclusive ends, which is another style of warfare, for instance. Are we really going to be jeopardized by a naval blockade from, say, for instance, in Ghost Fleet, it's China? Yeah, but why would they blockade something that they need themselves?
They blockade it so we can't sell it to the customers of our choice. Now, it seems far-fetched at the moment, but if the whole idea is you don't actually need massive capital ships, you just need the capacity to create havoc near harbours, again, we're sort of going back to the idea of sieges. Whereas, can you wait out the siege? Well, certainly survival-wise you can wait out the siege. Plenty of food, plenty of gas to run power stations. But are you bringing in foreign currency? So what it seems to suggest is we should always remember that we're relevant for what we dig up and grow, but in all other respects we're on the periphery of the global economy, and we should never really forget that fact, that we need to, you know, trade in iron ore and coal and gas and wheat and wool and food and all sorts of other things to probably everybody, and just be a fair player and gradually remove ourselves from being a pawn in other people's power plays.
Well, I suppose that would actually go some way to explain why we've been investing a lot of our effort at bolstering our naval capacities now. So if the worst were to happen and our trading relationships were to fall apart, we had the capacity to at least look after some of the coastal areas and the lines of supply moving into Australia, and we had some independent capacity to take care of that. But yeah, again, it's a difficult one to move forward on with regard to Ghost Fleet, because I think Ghost Fleet makes a number of assumptions about what the world is going to be. And while it's a really entertaining read and it's, you know, it raises some excellent points, things have changed, and things have changed to a point where I think that we need now a revised version of Ghost Fleet to see where it may actually take us in reality. What do you reckon?
I'm very glad that we're getting 12 submarines, because it seems in the world that's coming we need the ability to know what's going on, see what's about to happen, to have a quiet presence analysing far away what's coming towards us. And as much as people go, oh, it's such a big pile of money, it's going to cost us so much, oh, it'll take so long to build them. Honestly, I think I'd rather it was 15 than 12.
I'd say 20.
Because we need the eyes and ears over the horizon. We need this ability to actually work out in our neighbourhood how is the big power politics going to affect us, and how do we find a way to go about our business in the midst of big power politics, which I think has to be our way forward. So the assumption in the book that we just happily go along with the Americans and as a consequence we're blockaded, I would like to think that we'd actually just get on with doing business with everyone, recognising what just happened was awful, but it's not actually our battle. And that if the Americans were to enact something like ANZUS after the events described in the book, which of course never happens in the book, what are we going to do if the Americans on day one have lost the majority of their high-tech kit? What are we going to do? Fly our 2 squadrons of JSFs back with the same chips in them? Lend them our current generation shipping? I don't think so.
Well, that's it for today. Thanks for listening to this episode. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We are always looking to pass on the most interesting information on international relations and security to our social media followers. And until next time, goodbye from me, Shahrezad Gairat.
And it's goodbye from me, David Olney.
And it's goodbye from me, John Bruno.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.